First of all, let me say welcome to the BPF and welcome to our webinar on heat networks. My name is Rob Wall and I'm an Assistant Director here at BPF. I'm sure you know BPF, we're the British Property Federation, so we're the trade association, the membership body for UK real estate. So we represent investors, owners, developers. We represent those businesses whose business is buildings, as well as the professional supply chain, and that's across all different asset classes. And I'm pleased to be joined today by a great panel. Maybe I can just quickly introduce our panelists or ask them to introduce themselves. Ben, perhaps could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Benoît Dufour. I am a Senior Development Manager at Related Argent, and I am leading on the infrastructure work stream for our Bryan Cross Town project.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. And Martin, welcome to the panel, Martin.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Martin Mackay. I'm the Chief Executive at Clyde Gateway. We're an urban regeneration company based in Glasgow, and we're investing into heat networks.
Great. Thanks, Martin. And Chris, welcome to the panel, Chris.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, Chris Paul, partner at Trans and Hamlins LLP. I head up the Energy and Sustainability Department, and I'm based in our London office. So I've been involved in district heating, communal heating, heat networks since the mid-2000s. I used to previously do district cooling in the Middle East as well. And I get involved in schemes ranging from simple landlord-run schemes up to multi-phased concessions. So hopefully I can give some legal perspective today.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And Jenny, welcome, Jenny. Really good to have you on the panel.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm Jenny Curtis. I work for Vattenfall Heat UK. I'm the Managing Director of our UK heat team there. Vattenfall is 100% owned by the Swedish state. We have the grand mission of working for fossil freedom. We're looking to invest £1 billion in heat networks by 2030 across 5 to 8 cities in the UK, currently working in London, Bristol and Scotland.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Great to have you on board. And Mike, certainly not least, but last, have I got that right? Mike, welcome to the panel.
Well, at least at the moment. Thank you very much. Yeah, Mike Reynolds. I'm the CEO of Gren UK. We established operations in the UK middle of last year. Gren is a Baltic-based district heating business. We've got operations in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and actually Finland as well. And we're a sort of a new market entrant. We also have the magic billion number that we want to invest. But we're a bit further behind on our journey than other organisations like Vattenfall. So we're following hot on their heels.
Right. Thanks, Mike. Well, definitely a Scandinavian flavour to the session today. Well, thanks, panelists. Thanks for joining us. We're keen to make this as interactive a webinar as possible. So for everybody who's watching today, please do post your questions. You'll see there's a Q&A function within Zoom, so post your questions in there. We'll certainly make sure we leave time for as many questions as possible at the end, and we're keen to get through as many questions as we can. We'll also be recording the webinar, so we'll record this, then we'll share it through our channels. So if there's something that you want to watch again, you can, or if you want to share with colleagues, obviously feel free to do. But let's crack on. So let's learn more about heat networks. Let's hear from some of our BPF and SPF members about their experience of heat networks within real estate. And let's look ahead to some of the opportunities and challenges that may be coming downstream with the introduction of new regulation and new legislation. So Mike, I wonder if I can sort of kick off with you and ask you the $64,000 question. What is a heat network?
Thank you. So we originally had 5 minutes for this slot, but I think we agreed that this is a pretty informed audience. So we're going to try and do it in 2. So hold on to your seats. Heat network is effectively where you replace on-demand heating at the point of use, which is typically done by gas boilers or gas CHPs in bigger buildings, and you replace it with a heat source that is remote, is in a different location to the place where the heat is used. And what you do is you take heat from multiple sources. You could take it from energy from waste plants, from heat pump installations, from offtakes from industrial processes. You transport that heat through large networks of underground pipes that are heavily insulated, and you deliver it to a building. And sometimes you can deliver it right the way up to the end customer. And you make money by doing district heating by spending the money on the infrastructure, by putting that money into the investment needed, and by charging a fee for selling heat instead of selling gas. That is a heat network.
Okay, well done. I think you hit the 2-minute button. So Chris Mike has explained what heat networks are, but why is this such a big deal for the sector? You know, we've titled this webinar "Heat Networks: a Hot Topic for UK Real Estate," but why is it such a hot topic, and why now?
Well, I mean, so building on what Mike said, I mean, it's worth sort of giving some context. The heat networks aren't that new in the UK. I mean, these have been around for a while. I mean, the earliest one that we've been involved in, Pimlico District Heating Undertaking, back in the 1950s. So the concept is not new. Perhaps it's the way we're dealing with it that's changed. I mean, the things that are making it very relevant at the moment is we're seeing more of them, and you're going to see more of them in the market as a general rule. We've got you know, the government's net zero legally binding target is being reflected in all areas of legislation, but particularly in the built environment. So you've got certainly in England, you've got the changes to Part L of the building regulations. You've got the Future Home Standard, future building standard, and that is a move away from gas, and it's a move away from individual gas boilers to achieve you know, the targets you need on the efficiency of buildings. You're going to have either heat pumps, or you're going to have to have a low carbon heat network. So, you know, as a landscape on new build, we're going to increasingly see heat pumps. So people are going to start dealing with them. And now previously it was very city centric, very high density. But of course, when you've got that reflection in building regulations, and don't forget, we've got something very similar in Scotland, stricter emission targets, you're going to drive the need for potential heat networks and lots of different scales of development. So it's going to become the new normal, if you like. I mean, the UK is currently about 3% of our heat comes from heat networks. Government's aim is to push that to 20% by 2050. So that's a big uptick. That's going to be much more significant numbers. In Scotland, again, targeting 8%, a rise to 8% of heat by 2030. So, you know, I think that's I suppose my first point is you're going to come across them much more. You're going to see much more of them. Virtually every transaction will have some involvement with a heat network. So it's an area up to now you perhaps haven't been involved in, but it's going to something that's going to become the bread and butter of development. The other bit we mentioned on the intro, the regulations, you know, as this market share increases, and the government has got to look to how do they regulate the sector. So heat's been a bit strange in that it hasn't been a regulated utility like gas or electricity or water. And your consumer protection with heat came through the contracts. It was only as good as the draftsman of the contract, making sure that role was policed. Now you've got the Energy Act 2023 that lays this framework for consumer protection regulation in England. There's a Heat Network Scotland Act, again doing a similar thing to regulate the market for heat. And what does that mean? I suppose it means you're going to have a bit more assurance that the market is properly regulated. You're going to have the role of a regulator to fall back on. You're going to have some technical standards. So there's a lot of change in the sector. And I think that's why everyone's talking about this, because regulation means change. It means we need to look at how that impacts existing deals, and we need to look at how it impacts sort of new deals going forward. Part of the regulation is also heat zoning. So we've got the idea that you'll have you know, this step change in the market. You'll have, you know, previously through planning process, we've had the idea that you know, you might have in a Section 106 agreement some obligations to connect to a heat network, but it's fairly loose. Well, you're going to have, you know, very much a legislated heat network zone coordinator, heat network zones that are declared, and an obligation to connect unless you've got, you know, you fall within quite limited exemptions. So again, you know, it's that step change. You can't ignore heat network zoning, because that's going to mean that is your choice for a low carbon, low cost heat source, and it's going to be very, very difficult to sidestep it. The final point on our intro probably is energy prices. You know, we all saw the impact of the spike 2022, 2023, wholesale gas prices up 400% at one point. You know, that was a big change. And so people are, consumers are looking more carefully at their bills. Landlords and developers are much more concerned about what the bills look like to the end customer, and making sure it's fair and reasonable. So again, that has cast a light on these type of transactions. People are much more interested in understanding what the tariff means for the consumer and how that would cope, and perhaps provide some security by procuring heat through a bigger entity that buys lots of electricity or lots of gas or whatever. So again, blending those costs. So there's your sort of 4 areas, Rob. That's why we're talking about it.
Thanks, Chris, and a lot to unpick there. I know certainly in our response to the recent government consultation, I think there was broad support from the sector for regulation, but the devil is always in the details. There's so many issues there to really understand. And we've touched on the what, we've touched on the why. So now let's move to the how. I mean, as you say, Chris, this isn't new for the sector, and many of our members will have first-hand experience of heat networks, and great to be joined by Ben and Martin today who do. So Ben, I wonder if I could turn to you now and ask from your perspective, you're involved in Brent Cross, what's your experience of heat networks, and what are the lessons that you're learning from that exercise?
Thank you, Robin. I will pick up on some of the point Chris just made and just explain how we have to deal with that on our project. So just as a summary, Brent Cross Town, so being developed in a joint venture between Related Argent and Barnet. We have an old planning permission from 2014, and we've got about 6,700 homes and about 3 million square feet of offices, so quite a large scale development. So under our planning permission, and also of course under the London plan and the GLA requirements, we had a fairly loose obligation to connect residential buildings. It was not very prescriptive, but obviously as a project, we have made a commitment to be net zero by 2030. So in order to do that, we made the commitment to connect all residential building and all office building, so all our buildings on site, to a district heating network. And that was the basis on which we went out to the market back in 2018. We did a competitive tender with all the ESCOs in the market, and out of that, we decided to engage with Vattenfall for the provision of heat. Since then, we've also done a deal with Vattenfall for the provision of cooling for most of our offices. So why did we decide to go that way, and why did we select an ESCO? For us, obviously, as a property developer, what our knowledge is on is delivering buildings, delivering infrastructure and delivering buildings. So that's our risk, and that's our scope of work. So we needed to find a partner who was able to help us to deliver on our obligations in terms of district heating. And the view there is very much to share the role and responsibilities, to share the obligation, and to share the risks. So development risk is with the property developer, and generation and delivery of heat will sit with the ESCO. So that's how we structure the deal with Vattenfall. So our view was very much to create a very flexible, open, transparent, and fair deal. We didn't want a deal which was too in favor of the developer or too in favor of Vattenfall. So we had to find ways to do that. And because of the lack of standard document and the lack of regulation, etc., we spent more than a year sitting with Mike and others discussing and agreeing that deal. So that's a lot of time to be spent on a deal, a lot of money to be involved on lawyers, etc. So for me, the move towards heat regulation and the heat zoning is very welcome. We need more certainty, but we need also to be able to do these deals faster. From the start of the tendering to having Vattenfall appointed, that took nearly 2 years. And if we need to develop at scale, and if we need to deliver more heat network to help with decarbonization, I think the call is very much we need to simplify the process and go faster and go cheaper. And for me, that's kind of my key point. There are opportunities. Obviously, we've got large scale development, so yes, we can help with it, with the decarbonization. But I think the challenge at the moment is that lack of heat regulation. And I've been in the industry for 12, 13 years, and every year I hear that the heat market will be regulated in the next 2 years, and that has been a rolling 2 years. So that really needs to happen now. So I think that's probably all I'll say for now, just on that, and I'll pass to Jenny or Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I think good to sort of reinforce that point on regulation. Clearly, there's an open door in terms of putting a regulatory regime in place, but it just needs to be the right regulation, doesn't it? I mean, Jenny, Ben mentioned there that obviously Related Argent are working with Vattenfall on that heat network in Brentford. I mean, do Ben's comments sort of resonate with your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're delighted to be working with Related Argent on that scheme. It's a real flagship scheme, I think, for that part of London. And the way we're integrating heating and cooling really goes to show what we can do through a low carbon district heating network. I think the points Benoit raises. I mean, it was a trailblazer, that scheme. The market has moved a long way since then, and we very much welcome the introduction of regulation to the sector. I mean, the primary energy bill legislation is now in place. Obviously, the consultation has happened in terms of the zoning regs. There is devil in the detail in terms of a lot of those points, which we're continuing to engage with through the Heat Networks Industry Council, and obviously very keen to continue dialogue with the real estate sector, who are so important in terms of really getting this working on the ground. But for me, the benefits of regulation, I think the certainty of rollout that it will provide. I think it's really important that it is acknowledged, as Chris said, we're looking to move to 20% of the UK's heat being provided by heat networks by 2050. So that's 1 in 5 households, and it will be in most dense urban areas. So if you are in a town or city and you're doing a refurb of a big building, or you are building new build, it's likely it will be connected to the heat network. And that's important not only for developers but for the heat networks industry. It gives us huge certainty then to support our investment plans. This rollout, we think, will take 60 to 80 billion of investment in infrastructure, and that fortunately we have a lot of ESCOs and investors that are ready to provide that finance to support the long-term infrastructure investment. And that certainty through regulation should also support reductions in cost of capital and ultimately bringing down costs to the end consumer, as well as enabling us to speed out rollout. I think speed, as everybody's mentioned, is that is really important. With that regulatory framework, part of what's coming through zoning is a set of standardised contractual models, which again, we're working very closely on with government and legal firms to make sure that we take advantage of all the lessons learned through the blood, sweat and tears of deals done to date. I also think in terms of regulation, what we really need to make this a success is clarity and transparency on pricing and value for customers. So the consumer protection element of regulation is absolutely critical, and making sure that we're able to explain a clear narrative on what the costs are in terms of a fixed and variable fee to customers, and the differences that you get in terms of particularly this is an all-inclusive service that you'll get through a district heating provider. You don't have to worry about your boiler breaking down or any repairs and maintenance. It's all covered, full lifetime warranty on that. So really, how do we develop a strong story in terms of the added value that this can provide to your developments? And I think linked to that is those guaranteed service standards, but also technical assurance standards. So we're really making a break from some historic schemes here in terms of the quality of the infrastructure going in the ground. I think there are also risks that come with regulation. The costs of compliance is something that we're very, very keen to make sure doesn't act as a barrier to new entrants. But also, I think, and again, important for your members, important to understand that if you are operating a heat network on some kind of legacy scheme where through planning you may have been required to put in a communal heating system, even for quite a small development, that will be regulated. So you will be caught by the regulatory environment, and making sure you understand those obligations and can manage them, or want to bring you may want to look at bringing in third parties to support you in that regulation. I think the third point, though, really does come to needing a hearts and minds campaign, in terms of really getting heat networks on the map. I mean, everybody talks about heat pumps in the press, but heat pumps are a really important part of the solution, but heat is a local issue and we need the right technology in the right place. And what we can do through heat networks is we take locally wasted heat for local people and we create local jobs at the same time. So making sure that we get that story straight with people through the process that we're going through as regulation comes in is really, really important.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. And just a reminder to those watching and listening today, please do post your questions in the Q&A chat. We've got a great panel here, so a chance to ask questions directly to those on the front line. Martin, we've heard sort of from Ben and Jenny about the experience around Brent Cross, but obviously you've got your own experience. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that and sort of the lessons that you're learning.
Yeah, well, I'll maybe say a little bit about Clyde Gateway as a company, and then I'll talk about our heat network. So Clyde Gateway is an urban regeneration company. We're a partnership between Glasgow City Council, South Lanarkshire Council and Scottish Enterprise. We work in one specific area of the City of Glasgow and into South Lanarkshire Council. And as a company, we are rooted in people, place and jobs. So we're doing all of those kind of classic urban regeneration projects. We're dealing with brownfield land challenges, infrastructure challenges, and we are supporting new development. And we're about 15 years into that journey. And as part of that, we've been working on energy and carbon master planning since probably back in 2010. And as part of that, looking at heat networks as being a potential solution for our area. And so we now own and operate two small networks, a higher temperature network and a lower temperature network. So we work in partnership. Scottish Water Horizons, the commercial arm of Scottish Water, they own and operate the energy centre. And Clyde Gateway Developments Limited, which is our trading subsidiary, then we own and operate the heat network. Now, we also do that in partnership as well. So we have a provider who provides our metering and billing, and also provides our maintenance as well. So it means that the interface that the customer has is professional. They have an app-based system with a provider, so that they have a real kind of best-in-class system. I'll talk a wee bit about the networks. The first network, as I said, is a higher temperature network, and it'll be primarily serving an area of new developments, so new housing, plus office developments as well, with the potential for us to expand and develop that network over time. And I think the challenge, certainly in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, is retrofit. So how do we retrofit existing communities with heat networks? In many respects, new build housing isn't the challenge. The energy efficiency standards are good. But of course, in Scotland, you now can't get a gas connection from April 2024. So every development has to look at alternative means, whether that's heat pumps or whether that's district heating. And I think that's a point that I would make. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for this challenge. Heat pumps will certainly have their position, but heat networks provide an excellent opportunity for us to deliver a new build development as well as retrofit. So our higher temperature network is operational. We've got Keepmoat homes connected to that network, and one of our own developments, Eastwork, which is a commercial development, is connected to that system as well. And our future land sales, we mandate the connection to that network as part of those land sales. So that maybe picks up on Chris's point about the transaction and the nature of the transactions, which will change as heat networks become more prevalent. A point that I would make is that you need to consider and develop the partnerships to deliver heat networks. And not everybody's going to have that expertise in-house. And it's a multifaceted investment that requires both energy centre as well as network distribution, as well as a connection to customers as well. So we've benefited from those networks over time in those partnerships. The lower temperature network is pretty exciting. It's called D2 Grids, but it's a 5th generation district heating and cooling network. And in that system, we're using the heat directly from the wastewater treatment work. So we're taking trade effluent, or the effluent on one side of the system, clean water on the other, heat exchanger in the middle, and we produce heat at low ambient temperatures, and then we integrate heat pumps into that system. That then allows us to either boost the temperature up and heat buildings, or reverse it, cool it down and cool buildings. Alongside that, we have a larger scale solar PV, which helps offset the running of the heat pumps. And we also have heat storage as well. So the 5th generation district heating and cooling, I think, is more interesting in terms of where the systems might go. And it's about lowering temperature and increasing efficiency. But as I said before, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. You need to assess and develop the best solution. You need to allow for upgrades as well. But what I would say about heat networks, and nobody agrees on the technology. There's always going to be differences of opinion. But if you can get a low regret solution that you can get in the ground and get operational, then I think it's a huge step forward. And of course, cost is a big issue. You need to consider the counterfactual case, and then previously that has been a gas counterfactual case, and that's been a very difficult challenge when you're trying to build the business case for investment into heat networks. But that will change now with the regulations. And I guess for us, we've been able to attract grant investment, so the capex or capital expenditure has been easier, but certainly the revenue is harder. And looking at how we manage the model over time, how we can deliver those services ahead of demand, that being a real challenge, and how that cost is split. And I was speaking recently at a housing conference where I was saying it's costing us around £9,000 a unit additional cost in order to connect to a district heating network. But that's a new normal, and I think that cost needs to be shared. It needs to be shared between the developer, the network operator, and the homeowner and customer. And I think everybody has to participate in that. But it's important that we have good consumer protections built in as that, and our heat networks are registered with the Heat Trust. And I'll maybe put a couple of links on the chat.
That's great. Thanks, Martin. And certainly, so those cost challenges and maybe some of those quality challenges are issues that we have heard raised by members. I mean, Mike, do you think those sort of concerns are justified, or will actually, as we move forward, will the situation change?
There's definitely a legacy challenge with old schemes. I think there were quite a few schemes, particularly in London, that were built because of a planning process that came through because of the London plan, that were done by people that don't know how to do district heating. They were procured with processes a little bit like Benoit described, that are very expensive, and therefore a lot of people cut some corners, and inevitably plot developers would come along and value engineer the hell out of it. So you'd end up with this great idea of what you're going to do, and then it wouldn't get built. But frankly, I think those days are gone. And if you look across the market at the moment, there are really high quality networks going and that are performing, and customers are getting good standards of service. And to be honest, like if you just look across the rest of Europe, this is not an issue. Where you have a mature network built out, there's no issue. Like we typically will be getting roughly 30 gigawatt hours of new connections onto our networks every year. In the energy market crisis, we had 70 gigawatt hours in the year, because district heating is so much more stable and predictable. It didn't have the volatility. It didn't have the price shocks that happened for everyone who was on a gas network. It's very dependable. As Jenny said earlier, it works. There's no issue with down performance. For every story about a heat network, I'll give you 50 stories about people with boilers that don't work and that they can't get them serviced and they can't get them replaced. So, in my mind, this is an old issue that the industry's dealt with. What you're seeing in the market at the moment is a real surge of investment, frankly. You've got big schemes going in up and down the country. You've got 4 new, we're one of them, but 4 private equity backed businesses really scaling, bringing ambition. Lots of companies wanting to invest in this space. I think you've got regulatory certainty coming through. You've got zoning coming through. I think the rules of the game are going to be set. I think that the procurement processes will be easy. I think connecting to a heat network within 5 years in certain cities in the UK is going to be simple. If you look at what Vattenfall's doing in Bristol, it's still hard to get it done, but I think it'll get to a point 3 to 5 years where it's really easy. It's really straightforward and everyone knows how to do it. The contracts are standardized. You don't negotiate. It's easy. It's like connecting to the gas grid. So, I think I would encourage the group to look forward and look at what we need to do. Ultimately, we need to deliver a system that is, I passionately believe that district heating is the most cost-effective way to decarbonize urban areas, heat in urban areas. Okay, You know, if you're going to compare it with a gas network that's fully written down, where their cost of borrowing is through the floor, then clearly it is not as competitive as that. But if you're comparing it to putting in other infrastructure, you know, massive grid reinforcements and every building having its own individual heat pumps, it is 100% going to be cheaper to do district heating than that. And then from an operating cost point of view, for an end consumer, it is absolutely going to be cheaper than if they had their own individual heat pump. At a basic level, you get a heat network, you get socialization of cost, of the operating costs of it, you get socialization of the diversity of load. So you could generate for one building during the day because that's an office, and then in the evenings you're selling heat to a building down the road that's residential. So you can have the same generating capacity serving two purposes. And when you really get excited, you can start to do this bilateral heating and cooling thing for certain people as well. So, you know, I think part of our challenge, one of the reasons that actually, frankly, all of us are sitting here today talking to your members, is that I think that we need to move the dialogue away from, you know, what happened in 2008 into what's happening now, the schemes that are being developed now, the way the market's moving. And my view is it's a very exciting time. I would love to hear the property voice more at the table. I think that ultimately building owners are the customers of these networks. Members of BPF represent the people that will be using the heat. And I think that that voice isn't heard enough in the regulatory conversation. So it's really great that this meeting is happening, because I think that can start to really accelerate things.
Thanks, Mike. And before we move on to Chris, just on that last point, maybe for you and Jenny, I mean, what's your honest experience of working with the real estate sector to date? I mean, obviously you have great relationships at a scheme level, but generally, you know, what is the response that you tend to get from the sector when heat networks are put on the table?
I think, look, there's different types of, this is not one sector, right? There's loads of different people doing loads of different things. Like for every Argent, there's a company building an out of town residential development where their margins are, you know, really tight. It's very difficult to get it. They're not taking the same structured approach. And I think, you know, heat networks needs to work for everybody. What I've seen is a real change in the narrative. Carbon obligations and starting to be more of a sustainable business has moved from being just a planning thing to something that's more about the portfolio value and the value of the business. And that started to change the conversation a little bit. I think that the two sectors speak different languages, and we often talk like this. I think that district heating presents some real slippery challenges around the cash flows, because you're front loading investment in infrastructure to unlock land value in a way that you don't have to do if you're just fitting a boiler in every single property, because you can kind of do that as you build the house. So there's some challenges around that, but then frankly, that's why we exist, because what we do is we come in and say, right, well, we'll front load the investment to put the infrastructure in so you don't have to, property developer. And similarly for retrofit as well. So the conversations are changing, but I think we as a sector need to get better at listening to what the property sector is saying, and the challenges around cash flow, around contracts, around certainty, around deliverability, and make sure we can really answer those questions properly. I think we're getting better at it, but I don't think we're there yet. Jenny, I don't know if you've had it.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think it is very mixed, but we are increasingly seeing people, you know, in particularly in Bristol, where, you know, behind me you can see the water source heat pump that we've got in the floating harbour in Bristol. Which is a really great news story for a lot of big developers who have, you know, ESG and low carbon targets. We have people knocking on our door saying, when can we connect? When can we put, you know, when are you coming down our street with a pipe? Which is fantastic to see. I think one of the other challenges that we have with developers in Bristol is there's a lot of build and flip in terms of the institutional investor market, and that does still create some complexities in terms of the contractual arrangements. So the more we can be involved early and we can really get understanding of who the counterparties are for connection agreements and end users, the better. But, you know, I think as we get better at explaining what the service is, and again in Bristol we do now have a very standardised set of contract documents which are well received and not heavily negotiated, because we're building out there street by street rather than doing what we're doing in Brent Cross, which is a completely large new build standalone development. So it's horses for courses there, I think.
Great, thanks, Jenny. And again, just a reminder to colleagues, do please post questions in the Q&A. I see we've got lots of questions going in. You can see Martin starting to answer the questions, which is great. Thanks, Martin. But Chris, let's come to you. I guess on that last point, you know, it does feel like we're sort of at a bit of a tipping point, really, in terms of, you know, how the sector's evolving and new regulation is coming on stream, and there is certainly an appetite driven by climate commitments within the sector to move to low carbon sources of heating. But do you think the sector is really ready for this?
I mean, I pick up what Ben said earlier. I mean, we've been hearing about this coming for a while, and it's not that the can has been kicked down the road, but people haven't really engaged. So I think generally, I think that, you know, the message would be get ready, you know, engage with this and get ready, because although regulation will come in full 2025, the deals you're doing now, or the deals that are in the pipeline, need to consider how you're going to interface with regulation. So to give the example for existing schemes, you know, if you're a landowner with existing district heating, you should be looking at your change in law provisions now. You should understand how that might have to change as the regulations come on board. Again, if you're doing new schemes, bringing them forward now, looking at energy strategy, picking up on Jenny's point, you know, early engagement with the market to understand what the potential is there. You know, invariably we get involved on the legal side quite late in the process, and ESCOs are often tendered very late in the process. And the reality is that's where the skill set is. You know, if you can bring them in early as possible, they can make a huge impact to the success of the scheme. So there is that side of it. You know, we talked about standardization, and yes, it's important. I think the step change that has to come is a move away from developers seeing themselves as the policeman of this, you know, having complex agreements that deal with performance, deal with failures, deal with stepping rights. Once you've got regulation covers a huge amount of that. So again, it's a step change for those developers that care, those that develop and hold. They can rely much more on the regulator to provide that level of comfort. So again, we're finding our way on what that will look like. And there was picking up one of the questions, I mean, standardization is important. Schemes will be different. In the same way we have relatively standardized approach to gas or electricity connections, you're still going to have things that need to be made project specific. So there's still a job to document these things. But I think we all agree, you know, that the length of time some of these deals take to come to market, you know, is troubling. I suppose the final thought is that it's the smaller end of the market I would worry about particularly. You know, those sort of landlords or building owners that are running smaller schemes that perhaps haven't clocked that they will be a regulated heat network operator and heat network supplier and have obligations under those regulations. And if you haven't read what's coming, you know, that's your chance to look at how you outsource your operation and maintenance, your metering and billing work, and work out actually have I put to the market as much of that risk as I can, bearing in mind I'm still technically going to be responsible for delivery of that. So that's the step change. The final thought probably is that engagement with customers. This has been going on for years. As I say, it's not a new thing. But where problems happen, you only have to go back to the Which report a couple of years back, is when purchasers, tenants aren't told enough. They don't get enough information as part of the sales process or the tenancy process. And again, regulation helps with that, you know, an idea of what the contract should be given. But again, I think there's a lot of joint working there. So you know, summing up for me is probably look at your documents, look at your standard leases, look at your property documents. Make sure that they are aligned and are flexible enough to deal with a future where heating and heat networks are far more universal.
Right. Thanks, Chris. Well, let's move on to some of the questions. So I think we've raised a lot of the issues. Let's see what some of our viewers are asking. I mean, there's a few questions coming around cost, certainly cost for consumers. I wonder whether we might sort of drill down on that, I guess, in terms of what sort of consumer protections we might want to see to protect consumers. And also be interesting to know perhaps what's happening currently within developments to ensure that consumers get value for money. So I don't know, Ben, Jenny, within Brett Cross or within your experience, how are you ensuring that consumers get value for money when they're obviously obliged to plug into a network?
So as you can imagine, that's one of the main questions we are getting at the moment, because we are talking that as an industry, we still need to learn about district heating network. You can imagine that, especially as residents, maybe larger offices, tenants are more aware of district heating network, but as a resident into one of our flats, we do have a lot of questions about, why do I have to connect? Why can I only use Vattenfall? How can I ensure that the price I'm paying is not, over and above what I would pay with gas? There's often comparison back to gas, and because there is that notion of monopoly, we have a deal with Vattenfall. They are generating the heat and they are the heat supplier. So in the deal we did, we spent a lot of time on top of all the clauses Chris has mentioned. We spent a lot of time against benchmark again, because the heat trust is there, but it's probably not comparing with the right tool, so that we need to change. We're still looking at gas boilers, but if we want to move also to net zero and low carbon performance, the gas boiler is not the comparison we should use. So we have had to create a lot of, with Vattenfall and support of advisor in the industry, Bureau Apple and the like, we had to create our own comparison tool to make sure that we are putting caps on heat price and reason why heat price can be changed. And we, as a project also, we insisted on governance. So we haven't handed over the keys to Vattenfall for the duration of the concession. There's a governance in place where us as developer, we've got a board with Vattenfall, and key decision on the project, which may include price changes, have to be agreed at that board level. So it's just, we had to do, in that deal, we had to do what the regulator would be doing, basically, in terms of that, to try to mimic, basically, the regulation.
So you have a price cap within that agreement, do you, to give consumers some sort of certainty?
Yes.
Yeah,
which can be changed, of course, but it's there's a cap.
I think we see that a lot in historic agreements, and we willingly enter into those where the developer, or often it's the local authority, is the case in Bristol, is acting as a proxy regulator to provide comfort to those end customers in the absence of regulation. As Ofgem steps in, I think there will be much less need for developers to be involved directly in those sorts of discussions. Although I think joint governance is always a good thing, because ultimately, although this is an infrastructure investment business, it's also about the people on the ground. I mean, the Heat Trust is a really important body for now as a sort of voluntary proxy regulator, and we follow all the same sort of standards in terms of protection of vulnerable customers that you would expect in the regulated energy businesses. I think the point around not being able to compete with gas is a really, really important one. I mean, there are costs to decarbonisation, and that has to sit somewhere. Getting the right split is obviously a challenge. Us as an heat networks industry are working really hard to think about how we can bring down costs. So particularly reducing the costs of power that we might use for heat pumps through use of thermal stores, through time of use tariffs, and also through using waste heat. So where we can access heat at a low cost from a data center or an energy from waste plant, that does produce a much lower cost of heat than a pure electric solution. For us also as Vattenfall, the sort of social value element of what we do is really important. We are long-term investors in these places and in the communities that we're working in. So we do offer things like community energy development fund we have in Bristol, where we've put £1 million into a fund to support community energy projects and help address some of the disruption that's caused by the installation of the scheme. So it's an evolving picture. But yeah, I think you can be comfortable that the protection of the consumer is really important to any good ESCO.
Right. Thanks, Jenny. Martin, what's your approach in Clyde Gateway to ensure sort of value for money for that end consumer?
Yeah, I guess I picked up earlier on about that point around gas, and trying to compare heat networks to gas is incredibly difficult. But as an urban regeneration company in the area that we're working in, then also fuel poverty and how we address that is a significant concerns. So we do try and keep our pricing as competitive as possible. We do analyse the market across the relevant postcodes in terms of what the kind of gas cost is, and then we use that heat trust model as well. So we are trying to keep it competitive as possible. One of the challenges we have at the moment, particularly as we move into some of the retrofit areas, is how do we deal with customers in social housing compared to customers that might be in ownership homes, and how do we balance the price across the two? And at the moment, we're considering, can we have two tiers of tariffs, one for social housing and one for mainstream housing, and of course that brings its own challenges as well. We want to make a profit on our system in good time, but we would be reinvesting that profit back into the local community. So I guess there's always going to be that challenge later on from customers who are then saying, well, could you not just reduce our heat costs rather than retain the profit? But it's about trying to create wider benefits to the wider community as well. And I think that's where some of the opportunities exist with heat networks.
Great, thanks, Martin. I mean, Chris, I guess this plays into what we want to see in regulation in terms of those protections, but also sort of pulling in another question. I think there's a few points around how heat networks can support the real estate's net zero ambitions, particularly because some heat networks aren't zero carbon, particularly some of the legacy ones. So how do we resolve those tensions and the sorts of things we might want to see in regulation going forward?
Well, I mean, certainly, response to the consultation we've had on consumer protection in England is still talking about price caps being a potential, but possibly not to be applied. We're certainly going to see transparency on how prices are set out, how tariffs are explained. And I think that's useful because that will help, the ability to compare deal for deal. As it stands currently, if you're a developer procuring an ESCO, you're going to need some technical support. You go to market and you try and unpick and understand the assumptions the ESCO have made in coming up with their pricing. You're then sort of locking that in. And I think this is part of the struggle with the whole concession model. It's a lock-in on a financial model. And when you have things that are coming down the pipeline, like technical standards, that are highly likely to require carbon emission limits for existing schemes, we might have some leeway. There might be a fair amount of a transition period to deal with that. But the reality is existing schemes have got to work out in due course how they will decarbonise. And that's going to result in a need to adjust the financial model and a need to discuss that with the developer. We shouldn't be shy about that. That's the reality. The heat source changes, people's bills change, the tariff structure changes, and that's the reality. So I think that's coming. But again, regulation helps us because we can point to that. It's less of a choice. It's more of a change in law point in particular.
Great, thanks, Chris. Mike, a question for you. So are heating and cooling broadly interchangeable? So how do heat networks cool? Is it the same system or is it a different system? How does it work?
Oh, crikey, I love the technical questions. I mean, look, you could do fifth generation like Martin was describing, where you can have heating and cooling going in and out of the same system. For that to work, you basically have to have a balancing between the amount of cooling that's needed and the amount of heating that's needed. And it does work. It's been done around the world, but it's more complicated to do. Mostly what you see is you'll get heating and cooling networks running next to each other, but sharing generation. So if you have a centralized heat pump solution, for example, you can reject cooling one way and reject heat the other way. So you can sell cooling to the data center and you can sell heating to the heat network, and you can do it that way. So often, I think what you'll see is more that generation sharing will happen on networks. The interesting thing from a property development point of view, though, is that for me, and actually not just development point of view, for existing buildings as well, this is a move from a commodity model to a service model. So, and cooling is part of a service package. And I think one of the things as an industry we've got to do is be able to bundle this and package this the way that different buildings want to be able to bundle and package it. If you just take residential, you're going to get 4 or 5 different models that, some people are going to want you to sell to the end customer. Some people are going to want you to sell to the plot boundary and then they'll serve the end customer. If it's a social housing customer, they'll want you to split the bill. send half the bill to them because they pay for the fixed charge, and then the variable goes to the tenant. You'll have special tariffs for vulnerable customers. So there's lots of ways you can apply it. And I think the interesting thing about putting heating and cooling together is that you can start to go, what's the service building, and what's the bundled package that will work best for this building, and what's the most efficient way to do it. We're selling heat to a whiskey distillery that we just found out recently also spends a lot of money on cooling, which is an interesting thing because they could reject the heat into my heat network and I can do something with it. So my price to deliver cooling for them, if I get the right heat exchanger, could be cheaper for them than if they were to do an electric cooling system themselves, which is their alternative. So, you know, it's all energy fundamentally. You know, lots of heat in one place fundamentally means that there's cooling in another place, right? So the two can go together, but commercially and from a sort of system balancing point of view, it's not as easy as it can be made out to be. Benoit has his hand up because I think he's done some cool stuff on this.
So yeah, just wanted to add to a few points you made, Mike. So at Brian Cross, we decided also to then add a cooling deal to the heating deal, and the driver there was a few drivers, the carbon performance. So we selected Vattenfall on the carbon intensity by adding a centralized cooling system. Actually, we could improve further that carbon intensity and helping us with our net zero commitment. And also, yes, there is a commercial point. You know, when we install such a system, we have to do a business case on, you know, how much cost and space we need to do a centralized system as opposed to do standalone solution on each offices, and the space we would have needed at ground floor or on the roof for air source heat pump. So for us, they are carbon performance drivers and also commercial and value drivers, basically, to do a joint heating and cooling system. So it was all.
As you've got the speaking stick, Ben, there's also a question around sort of reliability. So, you know, can you get power cuts, heating cuts with heat networks, or is there resilience built in so that you get continuous heat?
So, of course, yeah, there is resilience as part of the design, and especially when you've got such a large energy center. You know, just if there are some technical people, we are talking 30 megawatt of heat and 20 megawatt of cooling for our site. So a very large piece of infrastructure. So resilience is built in, obviously. And then we have also, you know, as part of the agreement, it's the continuity of heat supply and cooling, maybe not so much, but the continuity of heat supply is a massive point of negotiation to ensure there are measures in place or solution in place in case there is a problem. So we spent a lot of time negotiating what Vattenfall would do in case of heat interruption. And I mean, you know, and that can go all the way to disaster recovery plan, you know, depending on the scale of the problem. So yeah, we spend a lot of time also trying to do that. And that's the questions you get, you know, when a plot developer comes, you just want to know, how can I be sure I will have heat 24/7? And that's one of the key things. And after it's the price, of course. You know.
Thanks, Ben. It'd be good to hear from Mike and Jenny on that point. Also, there's some questions around the conversation we had around standardizing contracts. I suppose some questions about, is that realistic that we can have standardized contracts that apply across the piece? And also, who's leading that? And I guess, where is real estate in that space? Mike, do you want to go first?
I
just waved Jenny through on that one, actually. So I'm going to wave her through because I think
I was just going to say on the resilience point. I mean, this is proven technology that was been operating. You know, we've got heat networks that Vattenfall built in Berlin, where we've got pipes in the ground that have been there for over 100 years and they're still going strong. So a lot of what we're doing here is not that complex, and the availability stats are really, really very, very good. We also build in full sort of resilience and backup into the system. So when we are offline for planned maintenance, but also if there is any reactive maintenance, there is full backup available, as well as you know, in line with heat trust, and it will again come through regulation, you know, sort of compensation regime if customers are ever affected. So the customer experience experience in terms of reliability should be much, much better than you would expect with either a heat pump or a gas boiler. So I think, I completely understand the concerns and the questions that come forward on that, but it's one we're very happy to, put our hands up and say this really shouldn't be an issue.
And can I follow that then? Because so everything Jenny just said, I 100% agree with. The other, excuse me, on the question you asked about standardization of contracts, it's a journey. All contracts are a journey, right? I mean, you can get a fully regulated utility where you're going to get a very, very standardized contract. But even then, on the biggest connections, there's still going to be some stuff that you're negotiating and you're arguing about. So, this idea that there's going to be one template and everyone's going to use it for everything, I just think that's not going to happen. However, you've seen real change in the last 10 years on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Now, that's been driven through lots of people procuring and doing heat networks, have been driven by conversations with organizations like related Argent, sorry, wrong way around, and others that are kind of saying, look, no, this is what we need. This is standard we need to hit. And also being driven by service providers in the district heating market saying, no, this is the standard we want to deliver to. Like, we want to grow this. We want to invest £1 billion. If we're going to put 60 to 80 billion in district heating and we're going to get a return out of it, because we're not, no one's going to do that for free, right? We have to have a license to operate, and that's going to be linked to contracts being straightforward, commercial terms being standardized, risk parameters being really clear between different counterparties. The interesting thing for me that's changing, which I think is exciting about the market, is the move from the related Argent model, which is where you get a landowner that could kind of control everything and drive it and act almost like a quasi-planning authority, to an organization saying, no, we're just going to go and do a district heating network in a town, and we're going to do that more at risk. That's quite exciting, because that's starting to change the way that you then have to buy it, because you're not procuring a heat network, you're buying a connection. And then effectively it's just, well, how much will it cost me to connect? What availability and service standards do I get? And what's the price of heat? So the negotiations got much more simple. You're not having to worry about the deployment of the infrastructure in the same way that I think that some master developers have had to worry about in the past.
Great, thanks, Mike. Chris and Ben, did you quickly want to come in on those points?
I was just going to pick up that point about sort of standardization. I think, I suppose what I'd say is there's lots of interest and lots of investors trying to come into this space now. It's very, very attractive. I think just be careful who you pick. You want to go with an established ESCO that actually has some documents and knows what they're doing. And as Mike says, there will still be an element of negotiation here, even if we do have standardized documents. The reality is you want advisors that, again, are familiar with the sector and know the issues that actually contain the real risks. And that's what will accelerate the delivery here, is actually getting your right consultants around you.
Thanks, Chris. Ben?
It was a very similar point. Be careful who you pick. And that was more actually for the advisors and the lawyers, actually. So I think it's just finding lawyers who are specialized in the energy world, and ideally who have worked both sides, who have worked for ESCOs and worked for developers, so that you start from a middle ground position and both parties know what's acceptable to the other, and no point trying to rob each other. That won't help. So I just that choose your advisors.
Uncapped liabilities, Benoit.
I think that's a really good takeaway.
No comments. No comments.
That's a really good takeaway for members. I think both from yourself, Chris, and you, Ben, about be careful who you pick. Sort of Jenny, Mike, Martin, if you've got one sort of key takeaway for members, for our BPF SPS members from this webinar or from heat networks, very quickly, what would that one takeaway be, Martin?
Just get the pipes in the ground and get the systems moving. That's our experience. Once you build it, and they will come.
Great stuff. Jenny?
It's coming, and it's coming soon. So engage early. Do come and talk to us if you want to talk about your development. Very happy to explain how it works.
Thanks, Jenny. And Mike, you've got the last word.
Yeah, I think the big thing here is it's not your problem, it's our problem. So make it our problem. Don't sit in a room trying to solve it on your own for the first time. Like, people have done this, they know what the answers are, we can help. This is big infrastructure. It's got big infrastructure players coming in and putting it in. So, we're ready to mobilize. I think get the right people in the room, and it's a much easier process.
Great stuff. And that's a really nice point to finish on, because we are quite keen that this is the start of an ongoing relationship between our sectors, because we have a joint interest and there's a joint benefit from delivering great heat networks and great development. So but thanks everybody for dialing in today. Thanks again to all the panelists for your time. It's been a fantastic session. We will record this and share this. Otherwise, have a fantastic afternoon, everybody. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.